Something big is shifting in the crypto space right now, and most people are not paying attention to the real signals behind it. When names like BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP start appearing in the same conversation, it is not random noise anymore. It usually points towards something deeper happening in the financial system that retail traders only understand later. The real question is not whether something is happening, but how big it could become and who is quietly positioning themselves before the market reacts. Because in crypto, the biggest moves are never announced loudly, they are revealed slowly through patterns, institutions, and liquidity movements that most people ignore until it is too late. When we look at the current situation around BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP, the first thing to understand is that the financial world is moving into a phase where traditional institutions and blockchain systems are slowly starting to overlap. This is not happening overnight, but the direction is becoming more visible with every passing cycle. BlackRock, being one of the largest asset managers in the world, represents institutional capital at the highest level, while Ripple represents blockchain based payment infrastructure that focuses on real world financial settlement. XRP sits in the middle of this conversation as a digital asset designed for liquidity transfer and cross border value movement. Now, the important point here is not about rumors or social media speculation, but about how global finance is evolving. Banks and financial institutions are constantly searching for faster, cheaper, and more efficient ways to move money across borders. Traditional systems like SWIFT are slow, expensive, and heavily dependent on intermediaries. This is where blockchain based solutions like Ripple's technology start becoming relevant in long term discussions. The focus is not on hype, but on efficiency and settlement speed. At the same time, BlackRock entering the crypto space through regulated products and institutional exposure has changed the entire perception of digital assets. When a company of that scale shows interest in the sector, it signals that crypto is no longer being treated as a fringe market. Instead, it is being studied as an emerging financial layer that could integrate with global liquidity systems over time. This is where XRP often gets mentioned in broader discussions, not because of price predictions, but because of its designed utility in liquidity movement. However, it is important to stay grounded here. There is no confirmed direct partnership between BlackRock and Ripple in any official sense that guarantees future price movements or adoption scenarios. What exists is a broader institutional trend where digital assets, blockchain infrastructure, and tokenized liquidity are becoming part of the same conversation. This is where most retail investors misunderstand the situation and assume immediate outcomes, when in reality, these processes take years to develop. What makes XRP stand out in these discussions is its focus on settlement efficiency. Unlike many cryptocurrencies that are mainly seen as speculative assets, XRP has always been positioned around payment corridors and liquidity bridging. Whether this vision fully aligns with global adoption depends on regulation, institutional comfort, and integration with existing financial rails. These are not emotional factors, they are structural. So when you hear BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP mentioned together, the real takeaway is not about instant price explosions. The real insight is that the financial system is gradually exploring blockchain based liquidity solutions at an institutional level. This is a slow transition driven by regulation, infrastructure testing, and long term cost efficiency goals. And as this process continues, the gap between traditional finance and digital asset systems keeps narrowing, but it does not disappear quickly. The next parts will go deeper into how this connection forms, what role liquidity actually plays in this narrative, and why institutional behavior matters more than retail speculation in understanding where this market could realistically be heading. To understand why BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP are even being discussed in the same context, you need to look at how modern liquidity actually works in global finance. Money does not simply move from one country to another instantly. It passes through layers of banks, correspondent institutions, compliance checks, and settlement systems that all take time and cost money. This is where inefficiency exists, and this is exactly the gap that blockchain based payment systems are trying to solve over the long term. Ripple's focus has always been on solving this liquidity problem, not by replacing banks, but by working alongside them. The idea is simple in theory, but complex in execution. Instead of pre funding accounts in multiple countries, financial institutions could use digital liquidity systems to bridge value in real time. XRP has often been discussed as one of the tools that could support this type of instant settlement flow, depending on regulatory approval and institutional adoption. The key word here is could, not will, because nothing in global finance happens without compliance and testing. Now, when you bring BlackRock into this picture, the conversation shifts from technology to capital scale. BlackRock is not a crypto project or a blockchain company. It is a global asset management powerhouse that deals with trillions in assets. When such institutions explore digital asset exposure, it is usually not driven by hype, but by long term portfolio strategy, risk diversification, and future financial infrastructure positioning. Their involvement in crypto related products signals that digital assets are slowly becoming part of regulated investment frameworks rather than being viewed as isolated speculative markets. However, this does not mean that BlackRock is directly connected to Ripple or XRP in a confirmed operational sense. There is no official evidence that they are collaborating on XRP usage or integrating Ripple's technology into their systems. What exists instead is a shared direction of interest, tokenization, digital settlement systems, and blockchain based financial infrastructure. These themes are becoming more common in institutional research and future planning across the entire financial sector. This is where many people misinterpret the situation. They assume that because institutions are entering crypto, specific coins will automatically benefit in a direct and immediate way. That is not how institutional adoption works. Institutions move slowly, they test systems, they evaluate compliance risk, and they only scale when regulations are clear and infrastructure is stable. This means even if Ripple's technology aligns with institutional needs, adoption would still be gradual and highly structured. XRP's role in this conversation remains tied to liquidity efficiency and cross border settlement theory. The argument is not about price predictions, but about whether a digital asset can function as a bridge currency in large scale financial systems. That depends on factors like regulatory clarity, banking partnerships, and real world usage beyond speculation. So when people connect BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP, the real underlying narrative is not a hidden partnership or secret deal. It is the gradual merging of traditional finance with blockchain based settlement concepts. BlackRock represents institutional capital entering digital asset exposure. Ripple represents payment infrastructure development, and XRP represents a potential liquidity mechanism within that framework. But here is the reality check: none of this guarantees immediate outcomes. The financial system does not transform overnight because of innovation alone. It transforms when regulation, infrastructure, and institutional confidence align together. That alignment is still in progress, not completed. We will break down how regulatory pressure and global banking systems influence the adoption timeline and why these factors matter more than social media speculation when evaluating XRP's real long term position in the market. Now, the biggest factor that decides everything in this entire BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP discussion is not technology and not hype, but regulation. In global finance, no institution moves freely just because a system is faster or cheaper. Everything must pass legal frameworks, compliance rules, and cross border financial regulations. Without this approval layer, even the most advanced technology stays limited in real world usage. This is where Ripple's journey becomes more complex than most people realize. Ripple has always positioned itself as a bridge between blockchain technology and traditional banking systems. But banking systems do not adopt anything quickly. They require years of testing, audits, legal clarity, and risk assessments before integrating any new settlement infrastructure. Even if a system is technically superior, it cannot replace existing rails until regulators are fully comfortable with it. XRP, in this context, has often been discussed as a potential liquidity tool, but its classification has been heavily debated in different jurisdictions. In the United States, regulatory scrutiny has played a major role in shaping how XRP is treated in the market. This uncertainty has slowed down institutional integration, even when technological interest exists. And this is an important point that many retail investors ignore completely. Institutional adoption is not just about innovation, it is about legal clearance. Now, when you bring BlackRock into this discussion again, it is important to understand their position. BlackRock does not operate like a crypto company chasing short term opportunities. It operates within strict regulatory environments and risk managed frameworks. If any digital asset or blockchain system is to be indirectly or directly involved in institutional products, it must first survive a long process of compliance validation. That means even if BlackRock shows interest in the broader crypto ecosystem, it does not automatically translate into direct usage of any specific asset like XRP. At the same time, global regulators are slowly shifting their approach toward digital assets. Instead of outright resistance, many financial authorities are now focusing on structured frameworks. This includes defining what constitutes a security, what qualifies as a payment asset, and how digital liquidity systems can operate within legal boundaries. This shift is gradual, but it is extremely important for long term adoption. Ripple's strategy has always been aligned with this regulatory first approach. Rather than trying to bypass traditional systems, it has aimed to work within them. This is why partnerships with financial institutions and compliance focused development have been central to its model. However, even with this approach, global adoption takes time because every region has its own legal structure. The key misunderstanding in the market is assuming that institutional interest automatically leads to immediate price movement or mass adoption. In reality, institutions operate on multi year cycles. They test, pilot, evaluate, and only then scale. This means even if Ripple's technology is eventually integrated into parts of global finance, the process will be slow and layered. So when people connect BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP in a single narrative, the real underlying factor is not secret coordination. It is the shared pressure of regulation shaping the future of digital finance. BlackRock represents regulated institutional capital. Ripple represents compliance driven blockchain infrastructure. And XRP represents a debated but potentially useful liquidity asset within that evolving structure. But here is the hard truth: regulation is still the bottleneck. Until there is complete clarity across major financial regions, large scale integration will remain limited. And that means timelines in this space are measured in years, not weeks or months. We will break down how liquidity demand in global markets actually drives the need for systems like Ripple's technology, and why institutions care more about settlement efficiency than the speculative price of any digital asset. If you strip away all the hype around crypto, the entire conversation around Ripple and XRP eventually comes down to one thing: liquidity movement. Global finance is not struggling because money does not exist. It is struggling because moving that money efficiently across borders is still slow, expensive, and dependent on outdated systems that were designed decades ago. Every major institution, bank, and payment network is dealing with the same problem, and that is why alternative settlement systems are being studied so seriously. To understand this properly, you need to think like a financial institution, not a retail trader. Banks are not looking for assets that pump, they are looking for systems that reduce friction. When a bank sends money from one country to another, it often has to go through multiple intermediaries. Each step adds delay, cost, and risk. This is not a small inefficiency, it is a structural issue in global finance. And this is exactly the type of problem Ripple's infrastructure is designed to target. Now, XRP enters the conversation not as a speculative asset in institutional thinking, but as a potential liquidity bridge in theoretical models of instant settlement. The idea is that instead of pre funding accounts in different countries, institutions could potentially use digital liquidity to move value in real time. This would reduce the need for idle capital sitting in foreign accounts, which is one of the biggest inefficiencies in global banking today. However, and this is where realism matters, theory and execution are two completely different things. Even if a system works perfectly in controlled environments, it still has to survive real world conditions like volatility, regulation, scalability, and institutional trust. This is where most blockchain projects fail at scale. The technology might be strong, but adoption requires alignment with existing financial infrastructure, not just innovation. When BlackRock is mentioned in this broader discussion, it represents something even bigger than crypto adoption. It represents institutional capital flow on a global scale. If major asset managers begin increasing exposure to digital assets or blockchain related financial products, it signals that the industry is moving from experimental phase into structured financial integration. But again, this does not automatically mean specific assets like XRP are directly involved in any operational system. The reality is that institutions often evaluate entire categories, not individual tokens in the way retail traders do. They look at tokenization, digital settlement systems, and liquidity efficiency as broad concepts. Within those categories, multiple technologies are tested, compared, and assessed before anything is implemented at scale. So even if Ripple's technology fits a certain use case, it competes with other systems and alternatives in the same space. Another important factor is that liquidity demand in global markets is constantly increasing. Cross border trade, digital payments, and real time settlement expectations are growing every year. This creates pressure on traditional financial systems to evolve. But evolution in finance is always slow because stability is more important than speed. No institution will risk system failure just to gain efficiency unless the new system is proven, regulated, and globally accepted. So when you connect BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP, the real underlying theme is not a hidden alliance. It is the gradual shift in how global liquidity might be managed in the future. BlackRock represents institutional scale capital thinking. Ripple represents infrastructure designed for financial efficiency. And XRP represents a debated component within that liquidity framework. But here is the reality check most people avoid. Even if all of this theory aligns perfectly, implementation is still far away. Financial systems do not change based on innovation alone. They change when regulation, trust, infrastructure, and global coordination all align at the same time. And that process is slow, deliberate, and heavily controlled. We will bring everything together and break down what this entire narrative actually means for the future of XRP, what is realistic versus what is speculation, and how investors should interpret these developments without falling into hype driven assumptions. When you put everything together, the connection between BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP is not a hidden storyline of guaranteed partnerships or secret financial deals. It is a reflection of a much larger shift happening in global finance, where traditional systems are slowly being forced to adapt to new technology, new payment expectations, and new forms of liquidity management. But the key mistake most people make is assuming this shift is already complete or that it will translate directly into immediate price explosions. That is not how institutional finance works. The real picture is more structured and far less dramatic. BlackRock represents the highest level of institutional capital, operating within strict regulatory and risk controlled environments. Their interest in digital assets signals that crypto is no longer ignored, but it does not mean full integration of any specific blockchain system into global financial rails. Institutions at this level do not adopt technology based on narratives. They adopt it based on proven stability, regulatory clarity, and long term efficiency gains. Ripple, on the other hand, has been building infrastructure aimed at solving real financial inefficiencies, especially in cross border payments and settlement systems. Its focus is not on replacing the banking system, but improving how money moves within it. That distinction is extremely important because it shows that the goal is integration, not disruption. However, integration at a global scale is not something that happens quickly. It requires years of testing, regulatory approval, and consistent institutional trust. XRP is often placed at the center of these discussions, but in reality, its role is still debated in terms of classification, usage, and long term adoption potential. While it has been designed for liquidity bridging and fast settlement, its real world usage depends heavily on regulatory clarity and institutional willingness to use it in live financial environments. Until those conditions are fully met, its role remains partially theoretical in large scale global finance. Now, the most important takeaway from this entire discussion is understanding the difference between narrative and infrastructure reality. The narrative says that institutions are entering crypto, therefore, specific assets will automatically rise. The infrastructure reality says that institutions test, regulate, validate, and then slowly integrate systems over time. These are two completely different timelines, and mixing them leads to unrealistic expectations. When BlackRock, Ripple, and XRP are mentioned together in the same conversation, what you are actually seeing is a convergence of three forces: institutional capital exploring digital assets, blockchain companies building financial infrastructure, and digital assets attempting to find real world utility within that system. It is a convergence of interest, not confirmation of direct execution. Another important reality is that global financial systems are extremely resistant to rapid change. Even if a new system is more efficient, it cannot replace existing infrastructure overnight. Banks, payment networks, and clearing systems operate on trust, stability, and decades of integration. Any new technology must prove itself over long periods before it can be trusted at scale. So, what does all of this actually mean for XRP in practical terms? It means that long term potential is tied to adoption, regulation, and real institutional usage, not social media speculation or short term hype cycles. If Ripple's technology becomes widely integrated into financial systems, then utility could expand significantly. But if regulatory and institutional barriers remain, then growth will continue to depend heavily on speculative market cycles. The honest conclusion is this: there is a long term structural story developing in global finance, but it is slow, complex, and heavily controlled. There are no instant outcomes here, Everything depends on time, regulation, and real world implementation, not headlines or rumors. And finally, from a risk perspective, it is important to stay grounded. The crypto market is highly volatile, and narratives often move faster than actual adoption. Many claims circulating online are exaggerated or based on incomplete information. Always approach these topics with critical thinking, not emotional reaction. Financial disclaimer: this content is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Cryptocurrency investments are highly volatile and risky. Always do your own research, DYOR, before making any investment decisions, and consider consulting with a qualified financial advisor. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to stay updated and subscribe for more market insights and analysis.